The storm began in the late afternoon, sweeping across the highway like a great white beast, swallowing the world whole. Visibility shrank to a few feet, and the silence of the falling snow was broken only by the occasional groan of the wind as it pushed my car sideways. The dashboard thermometer read minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and my phone had long since lost signal. I cursed myself for ignoring the weather warnings. The stretch of Montana road I was traveling was notorious for its remoteness, and I hadn't seen another car for hours. The blizzard worsened. My tires fought the snow-packed pavement as the wind howled louder, shaking the car. I couldn't see more than 2 feet in front of me, and panic began to creep in. That's when I saw it. A faint glow in the distance. I thought it was my eyes playing tricks at first, a mirage conjured by desperation. But as I drove closer, the light became clearer, a neon sign flickering weakly in the storm. The word vacancy glowing in uneven red letters. Relief flooded through me as I turned onto a narrow driveway leading to a small, weather-beaten building. The motel looked like it had been plucked straight out of the 1950s and left to decay. Snow piled high against its wooden siding, and icicles hung from the eaves like jagged teeth. There were maybe 8 rooms in a row, their windows dark and lifeless, and a small office building with a faded sign above the door that read, Rest Easy Motel. The parking lot was empty. I pulled up to the office and killed the engine, shivering as the cold air rushed in when I opened the door. The storm clawed at me as I ran across the icy pavement, my boots slipping, and pushed open the office door. A bell jingled overhead, announcing my arrival. The room was dimly lit, smelling faintly of mildew and something metallic. Behind the counter stood an old man, his face pale and thin, with hollow cheeks that gave him a skeletal appearance. His dark eyes locked onto mine as I entered, unblinking. Evening, I said, brushing the snow from my coat. Do you have a room for the night? He didn't respond immediately, just stared at me with that unsettling intensity. Then, slowly, he slid a key across the counter. Room 7, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Thank you, I said, hesitating only a moment before picking up the key. It was old, the brass tarnished, attached to a wooden tag with the number 7 burned into it. Sign here, the man added, pushing an ancient-looking guest book toward me. I glanced down and noticed the pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with names written in shaky, jagged handwriting. Something about it made my skin crawl, but I shook off the feeling and signed my name quickly. Enjoy your stay, the man said, but there was no warmth in his voice, just an odd finality. Room 7 was at the far end of the row, its door partially buried in a drift of snow. The lock resisted as I turned the key, and when I finally pushed the door open, the smell of stale air and mildew greeted me. The room was small and sparse. A single bed with a faded floral quilt, a wooden dresser, and a crooked mirror hanging on the wall. The radiator in the corner clanked and hissed, offering little warmth against the freezing air. I tossed my bag onto the bed and sat down, rubbing my hands together to bring some life back into my fingers. The storm outside howled, rattling the windows, but inside the silence was almost oppressive. That's when I noticed the photograph. It sat on the bedside table, framed in tarnished silver. The picture showed a man and a woman standing in front of what looked like the very same motel, their expressions stiff and unnatural, as if they were trying too hard to smile. But it wasn't their faces that unsettled me. It was their eyes. They looked hollow, unfocused, as if they weren't looking at the camera, but at something beyond it. And behind them, faint but unmistakable, was the reflection of another person in the motel window. I set the photo down, a chill running down my spine. It's just an old picture, I muttered to myself. Sleep didn't come easily. The wind outside was relentless, and every creak of the building made me sit up, heart pounding. Around midnight, I heard a noise that froze me in place, a faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the radiator, but the sound wasn't coming from inside the room. It was coming from the window. I sat up slowly, every nerve in my body screaming as I turned to look. Through the frost-covered glass, I could just make out the outline of a hand, pale and bony, pressed against the outside. My breath caught in my throat. The hand lingered for a moment, then slowly slid out of view. I rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain. Nothing, just the storm raging outside. I told myself it was the wind, that the snow and ice had created an illusion. But deep down, I didn't believe it. By morning, the storm had eased, and pale sunlight broke through the clouds. I packed my bag quickly, desperate to leave. As I walked back to the office to return the key, I felt a strange heaviness in the air, as if the place itself was holding its breath. The old man was there, standing behind the counter, his dark eyes following me as I entered. "Room okay?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "Fine," I lied, sliding the key across the counter. As I turned to leave, something on the wall behind him caught my eye. It was a collage of photographs, dozens of them, each one showing a different guest standing in front of the motel. My heart stopped as I saw the most recent addition. It was me. The photograph showed me standing in front of room 7, my face pale and stiff, with that same unnatural smile as the couple in the picture on the bedside table. And behind me, faint but unmistakable, was the reflection of a figure in the window. I didn't say a word. I didn't even breathe. I just turned and walked out, my legs trembling. When I reached my car, I drove as fast as I could, not stopping until the motel was miles behind me. Weeks later, I tried to find the Rest Easy Motel online, but there was no record of it ever existing. And sometimes, late at night, I see something out of the corner of my eye, a pale, hollow figure watching me from the shadows. I still don't know what happened that night. I only know that I'm not alone anymore. It was supposed to be a simple holiday tradition. Every year, my family rented a cabin in the woods for a week of quiet and relaxation before the chaos of Christmas. This year, though, it was different. For the first time, I was going alone. My parents had decided to skip the trip because of work, and my younger brother had fallen sick. But the cabin was already booked, and I convinced myself that a few days of solitude would be a welcome break. So, with a packed car and a playlist of Christmas classics, I headed toward the cabin, nestled deep in the heart of a snow-covered forest. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered it. A small, rustic structure with a steeply sloped roof, its wooden beams blanketed in snow. Smoke from the chimney curled into the cold December sky, a reassuring sign that the caretaker had come through to prepare it. Inside, the cabin was warm and cozy, with a crackling fire in the stone fireplace and the faint scent of pine lingering in the air. I set down my bags, kicking off my snow-covered boots, and took a deep breath. The silence was comforting at first. After weeks of crowded stores and blaring holiday music, the quiet felt like a balm. But as night fell, the silence became something else entirely. Heavy, oppressive. I sat by the fire, nursing a mug of hot chocolate. When I first heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from outside. I froze, straining to hear over the crackle of the flames. The scratching came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable crunch of snow underfoot. Someone or something was out there. My heart pounded as I set down the mug and moved to the window. The forest beyond the cabin was a sea of black, the trees swaying in the wind. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the sound came again, closer now. Summoning my courage, I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and stepped outside. The icy air bit at my skin as I scanned the area around the cabin. The beam of light illuminated the fresh snow, untouched except for footprints. They were large, far larger than any humans, and they led from the edge of the forest to the side of the cabin before disappearing. I followed the trail to the window near the fireplace and stopped dead in my tracks. Pressed against the glass was a single enormous handprint, its fingers long and spindly. The snow on the sill had melted slightly, as if something warm had been standing there, watching me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in short gasps, clouding in the freezing air. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard a low, guttural growl. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin made me jump, and I kept the fire blazing until dawn. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, I stepped outside again, hoping to find some rational explanation. The footprints were gone. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed, as if the events of the night before had been a fever dream. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond the edge of the forest. Determined to distract myself, I spent the day chopping wood, clearing the driveway, and trying to convince myself I'd imagined everything. That evening, as I settled back by the fire with a book, the power went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. The only light came from the fire, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I fumbled for my phone, but the battery was dead. And then, I heard it again, the scratching. This time, it was at the front door. I froze, my mind racing. Should I open it? Call out? Run? My pulse thundered in my ears as the scratching turned into a slow, deliberate knock. Hello, I called, my voice trembling. No response. The knock came again, louder this time. Grabbing the fire poker, I approached the door, my hands shaking. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening. On the other side, I heard breathing, low and raspy, like the sound of a predator waiting to pounce. Who's there? I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The breathing stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a deep, gravelly voice whispered, "Let me in." I stumbled back, dropping the poker with a clatter. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen. The voice came again, this time from the window near the fireplace. "Let me in." I turned to see a face pressed against the glass. It wasn't human. Its skin was pale and mottled, its eyes sunken and black as coal. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. I screamed, grabbing the poker again and swinging it wildly. The face disappeared, and I heard heavy footsteps retreating into the snow. The next few hours were a blur. I barricaded the door and windows, keeping the fire roaring as the night dragged on. Every so often, I heard faint laughter outside, a taunting sound that sent chills down my spine. When dawn finally broke, I threw my belongings into the car and drove away, not daring to look back. Weeks later, I learned that the cabin had a dark history. Decades ago, a man had gone missing in those woods, his body never found. Locals believed he'd been taken by something they called the Wendigo, a creature said to prey on the lost and vulnerable during the coldest nights of winter. I don't know what I saw that night, but I'll never forget the way it looked at me, hungry and full of malice. And sometimes, in the dead of winter, I still hear that voice in my dreams whispering, "Let me in." The invitation came in a plain white envelope, slipped under my apartment door with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, with a handwritten note, "You are cordially invited to the Winter Solstice Festival in Willow Hollow. Come alone. December 21st, 9 p.m. There was no explanation, no contact information, just an unfamiliar address scrawled beneath the message. I should have thrown it away. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. Willow Hollow wasn't on any maps. It took hours of online searching and calling nearby towns before I finally found someone who recognized the name. "It's a ghost town," the gas station attendant said, leaning against the counter. "Been abandoned for decades. No one lives there anymore." "Then why would someone invite me there?" I asked, showing him the note. He frowned, his expression darkening. "Don't go. People around here say it's cursed. Anyone who goes to Willow Hollow doesn't come back the same, if they come back at all." I laughed nervously, but the man's serious expression lingered in my mind long after I left the gas station. Still, something about the mystery called to me. A small, irrational part of me was convinced it was a prank, a joke from a friend who wanted to scare me. But another part, a darker, quieter part, felt an inexplicable pull toward that forgotten place. So, on the evening of December 21st, I set out for Willow Hollow. The drive was uneventful at first. The highway stretched endlessly, the winter sky a dull gray that seemed to press down on the earth. But as I turned onto the unmarked dirt road leading to the town, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, biting at my skin even through the car's heater. Snow clung to the trees, their skeletal branches twisting overhead like claws. The deeper I drove, the darker it became, until the road was swallowed by shadows, and my headlights seemed to barely pierce the gloom. I finally arrived at what I assumed was Willow Hollow just as night fell. The town was a collection of crumbling buildings, their windows shattered and walls covered in ivy. The streets were eerily empty, blanketed in snow, with no signs of life. But as I parked the car and stepped out, I saw something that made my heart race. Faint, golden lights flickering in the windows of the largest building in town. The building was an old church, its steeple crooked and leaning precariously to one side. The wooden doors creaked as I pushed them open, the sound echoing into the cavernous space beyond. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of wax and decay. Dozens of candles lined the pews, their flames casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. At the front of the church stood a group of people, their faces obscured by dark, hooded cloaks. "Welcome," one of them said, their voice low and melodic. I hesitated in the doorway, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run, but the figure stepped forward, holding out a hand. "You've come far to join us. Please don't be afraid." Against my better judgment, I walked inside. The group led me to a seat in the front row, their voices murmuring in a language I didn't recognize. As I sat, I noticed something odd about the church. The windows were painted black, blocking out any view of the outside world. One by one, the hooded figures began to chant, their voices rising and falling in an eerie, hypnotic rhythm. That's when I noticed the symbols, carved into the floor beneath the altar. Intricate designs that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked directly at them. "What is this?" I whispered to the person beside me. They didn't respond. The chanting grew louder, filling the air with an oppressive energy. My chest tightened and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. But when I tried to stand, the person next to me grabbed my arm, their grip like iron. "You can't leave," they said, their voice cold and devoid of emotion. Panic set in. "I don't want to be here," I said, pulling away, but the rest of the group turned toward me in unison, their faces hidden beneath their hoods. "You were chosen," one of them said. "For what?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "For the offering." Before I could react, they surrounded me, their hands grabbing at my arms and shoulders. I screamed, struggling against their grip, but they dragged me toward the altar. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly now, pulsing with an otherworldly light. This can't be happening, I thought, my mind racing as they forced me to kneel. One of the figures stepped forward, pulling back their hood to reveal a face that made my blood run cold. Their skin was pale and stretched tight over their bones, their eyes black pits that seemed to swallow the light. "You belong to us now," they said, raising a knife that glinted in the candlelight. Suddenly, the church doors burst open, a blast of icy wind extinguishing the candles. In the chaos, I broke free, running toward the exit as the hooded figures screamed behind me. Outside, the town was gone. The buildings had vanished, replaced by an endless expanse of snow and trees. My car was nowhere to be seen, and the dirt road I'd driven in on had disappeared. I ran blindly into the forest, the shadows closing in around me. And that's when I heard it, a voice soft and melodic, echoing through the trees. "You can't escape. You're ours." It started with a phone call, the kind of call you don't expect on a quiet December night when the world outside is blanketed in snow and the streets are silent. I was curled up on my couch with a cup of tea, the glow of my Christmas tree casting soft shadows on the walls, when the phone buzzed on the coffee table. The caller ID was unfamiliar, a string of numbers that didn't make sense. Still, I answered. "Hello?" There was no response, just a faint crackling, like static on an old radio. I was about to hang up when a voice broke through the noise, low and distorted. "Don't go outside tonight." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart racing. It had to be a prank, I told myself. Someone messing with me. But as I set the phone down, I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. The street outside my apartment was eerily quiet. The streetlights flickered, their amber glow dim and weak against the dark sky. And then I saw it. A light, faint at first, moving in the distance. It was too low to be a plane, too fast to be a car. I leaned closer to the window, squinting as the light grew brighter, darting through the sky like it was searching for something or someone. As it passed over my building, my phone buzzed again. This time, the message was clear. It's coming. I locked my doors, drawing the curtains tight. My mind raced with questions. What was it? Was this some elaborate joke, or was I in real danger? I tried to distract myself, turning on the TV, but every channel was static. Even the radio emitted nothing but faint crackles and whispers, like distant voices trying to break through. The lights in my apartment flickered, and the air grew colder, a chill seeping into the room that made my breath fog. That's when I heard the sound, low and guttural, coming from outside. A growl, followed by the crunch of footsteps in the snow. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a fireplace poker, and crept toward the window. Pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood in the street, illuminated by the flickering streetlights. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by shadows. But its eyes glowed, two piercing orbs of light that seemed to burn through the darkness. It tilted its head, as if sensing my gaze. And then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed directly at my window. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The poker slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor. The figure was gone when I looked again, but the sense of being watched remained, a heavy presence that pressed down on me like a weight. And then, the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything. My phone was dead, my flashlight unresponsive, even the glow of the Christmas tree extinguished. I fumbled my way to the kitchen, searching for a candle or match, when I heard it again. The growl, this time inside the building. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside my door, slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, and then a whisper, so faint I almost didn't hear it. "Let us in." The doorknob rattled, and I backed away, gripping the countertop for support. "Go away!" I shouted, but the rattling grew more frantic, the door shaking on its hinges. Suddenly, it stopped. I held my breath, listening to the deafening silence. And then, from the other side of the door, came a soft, rhythmic tapping. I don't know what possessed me to move closer, but I did, pressing my ear to the cold wood. The tapping turned into scratching, nails scraping against the surface, and then a voice, a child's voice high-pitched and sweet. "Please help us. We're lost." My blood ran cold. Against every instinct, I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. But as I pulled back, something knocked on the door so hard that it shook, the force reverberating through the room. This time, the voice was different. Deeper, older, dripping with malice. "You can't hide forever." I ran to the window, desperate for another way out. But what I saw outside made me freeze. The lights were back, dozens of them, floating through the air like fireflies. But as they moved closer, I realized they weren't lights at all. They were eyes. Hundreds of glowing eyes, attached to shadowy figures that filled the street, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were coming for me.